1-year anniversary since the last U.S. service member left Afghanistan. And for some folks, the families and the friends and a lot of veterans, that seems like yesterday already. But for many, a lot of Americans have already forgotten about the whole Afghanistan thing. So this op-ed was meant to just remind Americans of what happened, that how unavoidable or how avoidable this was, and that this was in fact a man-made problem that unfortunately was attributed to the White House and this president effectively not doing his job as commander-in-chief, and reminding Americans that there still are Americans stranded in Afghanistan 1 year later, and that there still are literally thousands of what are called SIV or special immigrant visa partners. These are Afghans who fought alongside U.S. American troops during the 20-year global war on terror that were promised to be brought to the United States. They went through the process and were given effectively special visas, and this administration turned their back on them, as well as the over 100 Americans still there. And so this piece was meant to just highlight the fact that, we can't forget these folks, both those who have given their lives and those whose lives are still at stake. But to highlight some of the ways that this was avoidable. And I highlighted in the op-ed 3 major strategic mistakes that were made by this president. And I'll start by saying that this president has yet really to put his commander-in-chief hat on. He wears a lot of hats, chief diplomat, chief legislator, chief administrator, chief of state. But one of those hats is the commander-in-chief, and I don't think he's found that hat. He's never executed as commander-in-chief, and this Afghanistan debacle was an example of that. But the first major mistake he made was in early April. Remember, this all went down in August of last year. So, 4 or 5 months in advance, he told the world that the United States would be withdrawing from Afghanistan by 9/11, by September 11th, which was why that date, why, such an inflammatory date that only had risk to the downside associated with, and there's no reason to make it a 9/11 withdrawal date. But to communicate to our adversaries that we were pulling out unconditionally, according to him, by a certain date, it's just literally breaking the most fundamental rule in a military operating manual. You don't tell the enemy what you're going to do, especially if it's an unconditional withdrawal by a certain date. And the second mistake that he made was a couple months after this statement, he surrendered Bagram Airfield, which was probably the most important base in Afghanistan, and it's also where they were housing thousands of al-Qaeda and ISIS prisoners, folks who were put behind bars during the 20-year campaign in Afghanistan for a reason. These are folks that either killed Americans or our allies or were planning to do it, and they were being housed in the prison at Bagram. Well, our president decided to pull out of Bagram in the middle of the night without talking or coordinating with our Afghan government partners. And in doing so, they were able to release these thousands of prisoners. And so that was the second major error. And a lot of folks say, well, that's part of the withdrawal is to leave the bases. But it doesn't have to be. When you look at the history of our nation in major conflicts, whether it's World War I, World War II, for instance, we still kept a strong footprint in Europe and Germany. We kept a strong footprint in Japan on the heels of World War II, as well as in Korea on the heels of the Korean War. The Vietnam War, we kept a strong presence in Southeast Asia. After the first Iraq War in the early 90s, we established a stronghold in the Middle East in Bahrain and Kuwait. And so it wasn't unprecedented to keep something as strategic as Bagram Airfield, which happens to be on the back porch of China and Russia, so that we can continue to act as a stabilizing force in Afghanistan. But he abandoned that in the middle of the night, and then also left, millions of dollars, billions of dollars, in fact, of weapons behind with it. And then the third major error was when late July and early August, we started seeing the Taliban take control and people dying and some of these violent attacks occurring. This president failed to transition the mission from a State Department-run mission to a Defense Department mission, and failed to recognize that this went from being a diplomatic endeavor to more of a military one. And with that, we saw them effectively pretending like this was just going as planned. They kept calling it a success, and then shortly thereafter, we saw 13 American lives, 11 Marines, one Navy corpsman sailor, one Army soldier killed because of a lack of planning and a lack of preparation. They knew it was coming on the ground, and still our president and his administration, his cabinet, failed to take the proper measures. So these were three massive strategic mistakes, and they were made intentionally. You know, it's not like they went left instead of going right. They said they deliberated for months or over a year to fulfill this campaign promise, but in the end, they didn't do that. They lied to the American people. They touted it as a success when literally thousands of people were being killed during this withdrawal. And it's a scar on our nation's history, and in my opinion, it's one of the biggest strategic errors that a sitting president has made. And we've got to hold folks accountable for this, and more importantly, we've got to remember the lives lost and not make these mistakes in the future.
No, thank you very much for that breakdown. In your opinion, considering, you're identifying these three major mistakes, why were these decisions made? What were these reasoning behind it?
Well, it's difficult to try to rationalize something that is irrational. I think in the end, this administration was so eager to fulfill a campaign promise. And look, I didn't want us to stay in Afghanistan for as long as we were either. We were due to get out of there, and the previous administration was saying the same thing, that we needed to get out of Afghanistan. But the way you go about the withdrawal matters, right? You don't just abandon your allies in the middle of the night. You don't. If you recall, in June, July timeframe, Biden actually removed the military presence before we were able to get all of our civilians out of Afghanistan. So that was unprecedented. And he was basically running with scissors at that point. And rather than deliberating with the next strategic move and what the best way to pull out is and coordinating with our allies on the ground there, they were so eager to just fulfill a campaign promise. And they did it poorly. They just executed about as abysmally as you can. And in this case, the running with scissors, they ended up falling down on them. And if you recall, he pulled out all of our military, and everyone questioned, why pull military out? We still have all these civilians there, some of them government contractors, some of them families still in Afghanistan. And within a couple of weeks, we ended up having to send thousands of more military back because it was so poorly executed. And so they botched it. They didn't know what they were doing, and they were so eager to say that we were out of Afghanistan. And unfortunately, in this case, the price tag for that withdrawal ended up being 13 American lives that should not have been lost.
Thank you for that breakdown of your op-ed, and especially the withdrawal from Afghanistan. If you are just joining us, we're here with Congressman Mike Garcia, who represents our Santa Clarita Valley, and he's telling us about what he's been up to advocating for our area, and most recently an opinion piece that he put out in Fox News about to kind of remind us of the loss of 13 service members during the withdrawal in Afghanistan. Moving on, Mike, last week you took part in a panel organized by KHTS and Action Drug Rehab here in Santa Clarita, addressing the rampant issues that our valley is experiencing with drug issues, and most specifically fentanyl. And for our listeners, if you don't know what fentanyl is, it's a powerful, very dangerous synthetic opioid. It can be up to 100 times more potent than morphine. And this year alone, that's from January to now, has been credited with the deaths of 21 people in our area. Mike, as our representative in the federal government, what are you doing to help protect our residents?
Yeah, and this is very important because this first of all, Kerry at Action Drug Rehab did an amazing thing. He brought together multiple levels of government. So we had myself representing the federal government. We had local government with Mayor West there, as well as the sheriff, Alex Villanueva there, and school board members. Joe Messina was there as well. So this was a whole of government press event to inform parents of this issue. And so that goes to the first thing that I'm doing at the federal level is I'm taking this on as an issue that we're going to put a bright, shining light on. There's several parents from Santa Clarita even that I've met with who have lost their children to this fentanyl problem, and they had no idea that their kids were using these pills, and they certainly had no idea that their kids were ordering these pills through social media apps like TikTok online without their knowing. And so step one is this awareness that if your neighbors or your friends or your family members can die of this stuff, then your kids can be just as vulnerable. And it's not a small problem. This is a major problem. We had 21 people killed from fentanyl this year. And these aren't overdoses. These are poisonings, and this is something that the parents I've met with, the fathers tell me very clearly that this wasn't an overdose. An overdose happens when someone is taking a drug and they take too much of it, and they are taking something that they know they're taking. In this case, these kids think they're taking Xanax or Adderall or some sort of Oxycontin, and it's made with fentanyl. It's not laced with fentanyl. It's literally made with fentanyl, and the wrong batch of this stuff will kill you. And it turns out that something like every 1,000 pill is a lethal dosage of this stuff. So that's step one. The second thing we need to do at the federal level, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that will actually make fentanyl a Schedule I drug, meaning it's treated like cocaine. It's treated like meth, or heroin. Right now, it's not treated like this dangerous drug that it actually is. And so when someone's arrested for dealing it or selling it, they're not prosecuted as if they are a drug dealer in the more, common sense that we're used to. Meaning they're not really charged, they're not put behind bars, or they're not taken off the streets. And so these drug dealers are incentivized to now sell fentanyl rather than cocaine because there's more money in that, right? Mm-hmm. So that's step number two. And then step number three from a federal level is to support legislation and policy that actually secures our border. All of this fentanyl is coming across our southern border. Most of this material is made in China, just like many of the things that we buy at Walmart, but in this case, it's being sent to Mexico to fabricate. And so these raw materials are used and put in devices, put into pill form, or kept into powder form in Mexico, and it's brought across our border. And I don't like using the term smuggled across our border because the bottom line is there's really no enforcement at our border right now, and people are allowed to just come in. And so it's a matter of just hiding the stuff, and it's very easy to get stuff across our southern border with as porous as it is. So putting a bright light on the fact that our border policy right now from this White House is driving this. It's incentivizing the import of this very dangerous drug, and we've got to stop it. And then the last thing is just getting funding for facilities to be able to treat kids with these addictions and to get help into the schools, and making sure that the grant programs for our law enforcement are kept whole. And this whole defund the police movement, my opponent supports defund the police. And one of the dangerous things with defund the police is that they actually do it. They actually do take money from the LA sheriffs, LAPD, hundreds of millions of dollars in our case. And when they do that, the sheriffs need to make choices. They need to still, keep cops on the books. They got to pay them. They've still got to go after the hard felons and go after these expensive cases. But when they do that, they can't afford the drug task force like the fentanyl task force. Mm-hmm. And so Santa Clarita Valley Sheriff's just reconstituted the fentanyl task force, and we're helping to get funding for all of these things, supporting grants from the federal government to the local sheriff's agencies, similar to what we did with the marijuana eradication issue that we had, the illegal grows. Mm-hmm. So supporting law enforcement financially is the fourth major pillar behind this. And if we do those four things, and then the local politicians and parents pay attention, if the schools pay attention, and we hold criminals accountable for selling this stuff, then we will start making an impact. But there are way too many people dying of this stuff in Santa Clarita right now, and I think 21 in Santa Clarita is the most of any city within LA County right now, and so this is a real problem for us here in Santa Clarita.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you here, and I think there's not much anybody can say that something has to be done. These are people who are dying because they make one decision usually, and it doesn't give people who would have the possibility of recovery, even if they are already addicted to something, the chance to do that. It just kills them.
Yeah, and the statement that Carrie made there live at the event that really stuck with me is that unlike any other drug that you get addicted to over time, mm-hmm. Fentanyl, the way it behaves chemically, is like as soon as you take it, you're addicted to it. And these kids don't even know they're taking it. They just think they're taking something that is normally a prescription drug, and it ends up being made with fentanyl. So it's very dangerous. They're hooked to something that is eventually, it's like playing, Russian roulette with
2
with
bullets.
3 trigger pulls instead of just one, right? Or 3 bullets instead of just one, and it's ultimately going to get you.
Yeah, I do want to say something that we were speaking with one of the counselors with Action, and he said something along the lines of he works with parolees and active inmates, and he mentioned that a lot of the times people who regularly use drugs will actually start carrying Narcan, which is essentially the chemical that allows people to stop an overdose while it is happening, because the addiction to fentanyl happens so quickly that now no other drug will do, and they're expecting to be poisoned to overdose, and that's the only way to get that level of high. So they're expecting to essentially walk the line between life and death every time they take it, and that is an incredibly dangerous mindset to have. And these are, I don't want to say professional drug users, but these are experienced drug users, I should say. And that's nothing compared to the kids who are falling into this situation. Anyway, I just wanted to share that.
It's the only way to save someone's life once they start experiencing this overdose. And, you know, it's like a hiker that goes hiking in rattlesnake-infested hills. They carry antivenom with them. And Narcan, in this case, is the antivenom to this very poisonous drug. And the problem is it's in our schools, it's in our homes, it's in our jails, it's everywhere we go. And, you know, hats off to the local sheriffs who have saved so many lives with Narcan, just being there at the right time with this thing. But these things cost money. We've got to fund them. And it requires everyone to be aware of the problem and be able to recognize when someone's having a poison event.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for talking with us about this. These are a couple of really serious issues here. We're coming to the end of our time here with you. What can we expect to see from your office in the next couple of weeks?
Well, we're continuing to fight this out-of-control inflation, out-of-control, spending, and the impacts of all of this. A lot of no votes coming up on spending bills here very soon, in September when we're in session. And as always, if anyone has any issues with a federal agency, IRS, Social Security, State Department for passports and visas, veterans especially, feel free to call us. That's our job. We something that takes folks 6 months can take us a few days, and you shouldn't have to call your congressman for help, but we're certainly here to do that. And we look forward to folks reaching out for support.
Well, we appreciate you, Mike. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Jade. Appreciate you.
For those of you listening out there, you'll be able to read more about Congressman Garcia and what he's been up to in Washington over on our website at hometownstation.com or on social media at KHTS Radio.